Good morning. Today we will be talking about Case Study 1, Restless Leg Syndrome for American Public University for Principles of Genetics with Professor Dr. King, and it is January 30th, 2022. So this case involves 9 people. 1 in 20 people suffer from restless leg syndrome. So first we have Suzanne and Michael, who both have red hair and pale skin. They also have no family history of restless leg syndrome. They eventually have identical twin boys, Marvin and Gary, who also have red hair and are not able to tan. So Jackie and David have dark brown hair, but David has restless leg syndrome. Eileen, their daughter, does not have restless leg syndrome and has dark brown hair also. Gary, one of the identical twin boys, marries Eileen, and they have a son named Todd, who does not tan, has red hair, and also suffers from restless leg syndrome. Personal interest about this case is a lot of people that I know suffer from restless leg syndrome. I think I even have it sometimes. It really does cause you to have sleepless nights just from the uncontrollable urge to move your legs with this uncomfortable feeling. I also did not know that restless leg syndrome could be inherited. So worksheet questions. To understand this case better, it's easy to assign dominant and recessive traits of each individual for restless leg syndrome. And for the red melanin gene, normal legs will be represented by the alleles NN and capital N lowercase n. Restless leg syndrome will be represented by the alleles NN, both lowercase. Brown hair will be represented by the alleles capital BB and capital B lowercase b. And red hair will be lowercase b, lowercase b. N is a dominant allele, lowercase n is a recessive allele, capital B is a dominant allele, and B is a recessive allele, lowercase b. So normal legs will be represented by capital N's and a capital N and a lowercase n. Restless leg syndrome will be represented by both lowercase n's. Dark brown hair is represented by uppercase BB or uppercase B and lowercase b, and red hair will be represented by both lowercase b's. So the first question we have is, which individuals must be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome? We know that Michael and Suzanne do not have our restless leg syndrome or RLS, but both have red hair and cannot tan. Therefore, Suzanne has the traits NNBB or NNBB, both capital or capital and lowercase. And Michael has the traits capital N, lowercase b, or capital N, lowercase b, lowercase b. They have the twins Gary and Marvin. Marvin has the trait capital N, lowercase n, and lowercase b, and Gary has the trait capital N, lowercase n, and lowercase b, and lowercase b. Jackie has the traits uppercase N, uppercase B, lowercase b. Also uppercase N, uppercase B, lowercase b, or capital N, lowercase n, capital B, and David has the traits lowercase n, uppercase B, lowercase b, or lowercase n, capital B, capital B. They have Eileen, who has the trait capital N, lowercase n, capital B, and lowercase b. Gary and Eileen have a son, Todd, who has the traits of lowercase n, capital B, or lowercase b, and lowercase b. So in simpler terms, Suzanne and Michael do not have restless leg syndrome, but Gary and Eileen's son, Todd, does. Eileen has the recessive allele for restless leg syndrome from her father, David, but Gary also has has to have a recessive allele for restless leg syndrome to be passed to Todd. And either Michael or Suzanne must be heterozygous for the allele to be passed to Gary and Marvin also. So, Marvin, Gary, and Eileen are the individuals that must be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome. Worksheet questions continued. Question 2. Which individuals might be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome? So Suzanne, Michael, and Jackie are the individuals that might be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome. They might be heterozygous for restless leg syndrome because they have the possibility of possessing the trait N, lowercase n. Jackie might be homozygous dominant or heterozygous for restless leg syndrome due to David having 2 recessive alleles and Eileen not having restless leg syndrome. Michael or Suzanne might be heterozygous, but only one of them is required to be heterozygous. One of them may be heterozygous for the dominant allele, normal legs, or homozygous dominant. Worksheet questions continued. Question 3. Which individuals might be heterozygous for the red melanin gene? The individual that is heterozygous for the red melanin gene is Eileen. Jackie could be heterozygous for the red melanin gene, but we can't be sure. Todd has restless leg syndrome and red hair, therefore we know that Eileen has to possess the heterozygous red melanin gene. Worksheet questions continued. Question 4. If Marvin marries a woman who has restless leg syndrome and red hair and cannot tan, what is the probability that a child of theirs will inherit both traits? The best way to see the probability is to make a Punnett square. So we see here that we have the dominant allele for normal legs, and then for red hair, and then we have the recessive allele for normal legs, and the recessive allele for for red hair. And then both the recessive traits for restless leg syndrome and red hair are the red melanin gene. And the phenotype that we get is 4 out of 4 with the red hair and 2 out of 4 with the restless leg syndrome. And the genotype is 2 of 4 with NN, capital N, lowercase n, BB, and 2 out of 4 for the recessive alleles NN and BB. So the possibility of the child having red hair would be 100%, and the possibility of the child having restless leg syndrome would be 50%. So the probability of their child having both red hair and restless leg syndrome is 50%. Class connection. In this case, we have families that have red hair, cannot tan, and deal with restless leg syndrome. The law of segregation, or as we know, Mendel's second law, can relate to these traits. The law of segregation is, in gamete formation, the alleles at a gene locus segregate from each other. Each gamete has an equal probability of containing either allele. For example, we know that Jackie and David both have brown hair and had a baby, Eileen, that had brown hair. Eileen actually possesses the brown hair trait and the red hair trait because either her mom passed down the red hair trait and her dad passed down the dark hair trait, or vice versa. Mom and dad have 2 traits for hair color, but the prodigy only gets 1 trait from each. Another important concept of this case is alleles. Alleles are one of 2 or more versions of a gene, and there are dominant and recessive alleles. For instance, in this case, we have normal legs that are represented as dominant in or dominant in and recessive in. And it is dominant. It is dominant because even if it has 1 copy of the allele, it will show its effect. If the allele is recessive, it needs both copies of the allele to show its effect, such as Todd having both RLS and red hair. Lastly, Punnett squares and a single locus test cross are important. Punnett squares help determine ratios and genotypes and phenotypes. A test cross helps when there is uncertainty of a genotype. For example, a Punnett square was used to determine the probability of Marvin and his wife's baby having red hair and RLS. Additional information. Here's some other interesting information on restless leg syndrome that I found. Restless leg syndrome is also called Willis-Ekbom disease, and it is a neurological nervous system disorder that causes the trouble to sleep due to an uneasy feeling in the legs, such as itching, pulling, aching, or throbbing. And this really keeps people up because they feel like they constantly need to move their legs throughout the night. It is more common in women than in men, and about 10% of people suffer from restless leg syndrome, and we get that from Duncan. To treat restless leg syndrome without drugs, people take hot baths, get leg massages, and put heat or ice packs on their legs. Some medications that help are roperidol and pramipexole because they send dopamine to the brain. There are 3 loci that have vulnerability to restless leg syndrome. They are located on chromosome 12q, 14q, and 9q, with an autosomal dominant mode of inheritance. They are now labeled as RLS1, RLS2, and RLS3. I also have a video here that I found pretty interesting. It is 8 minutes long, so I won't be able to really go over it, but it just goes over the symptoms and treatments and kind of how restless leg syndrome is caused. So another additional information is Pheo Melanin is when a person has red or blonde hair, freckles, and cannot tan. It's pretty much the red melanin gene. So the MC1R gene produces a protein called the melanocortin-1 receptor that plays a role in pigmentation. The MC1R polymorphisms reduce the ability of the melanocortin-1 receptor to make eumelin, and eumelin is the one that produces darker skin, darker hair, and so that causes the melanocytes to make mostly pheomelanin. And here I have my references, and that is my slideshow, case study 1.